Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 151. At noon when the sun is shining brightly, or at night when one imagines it is the hour of the rat, it is always delightful to hear the emperor summon his gentlemen to the imperial bedchamber when he has retired. I love to hear His Majesty playing the flute in the middle of the night. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 152. Captain Narinabu is a son of His Reverend Highness, the Minister of Military Affairs. He is not only extremely handsome, but has a delightful nature. I can well imagine how Kainsuk's daughter must have suffered when he abandoned her, and she had to accompany her father to his post in Iyo. No doubt the captain, having heard that she was to leave at dawn, came to visit her on the previous night. How beautiful he must have looked in his court cloak as he made his way home by the pale moonlight. In the past, he used frequently to come and talk with me, and he would say very disagreeable things about people. There was in those days a certain lady in waiting called Hayabu who was scrupulous about performing abstinence and the like, and who used her family name at court. She had been adopted by some family like the Terras and wanted to be known by their name, but the young ladies in waiting found it amusing always to call her by her original surname. Lady Hayabu was not particularly good looking. In fact, it was hard to find anything to recommend her. Yet she was always pushing herself forward in the palace. The Empress observed this, and one day she mentioned how she disliked such behavior. But out of malice, everyone refrained from warning the lady. At this time, I was living with Shikibu no Amodo in quarters that had been arranged for us in the palace of the First Ward. It was a charming little room under the eaves directly opposite the eastern gate, and we stayed there all the time, inviting only people whom we liked. The Empress herself used to come and visit us. One rainy evening, when the Empress had said that we must all spend the night in the palace, Shikibu no Amodo and I went to bed in the southern ante-room. Presently, there was a loud knocking at the door. We agreed that it would be a nuisance to have a visitor, and pretended to be asleep. But then someone called my name loudly, and I heard the Empress say, "Go and wake her. I'm sure she's only pretending." Lady Hayabu came in and tried to wake me, but I did not stir. Hayabu reported this to the Empress, and then went out to the veranda and began a conversation with my visitor. I did not think this would last very long, but the night wore on and still they were chatting away. It seemed fairly certain that the visitor was Narinabu. What on earth could they be discussing all that time? I lay in bed, chuckling to myself, something that the couple on the veranda could hardly have suspected. When dawn came, my visitor finally went home. What a terrible man, I thought. If he ever comes again, I shall refuse to speak to him. What can they have found to say to each other all night? Just then, Hayabu pushed open the sliding door and came in. On the following morning, she heard Shikibu and me talking in our ante-room and joined us. A man who comes in such a heavy rainstorm to visit a woman deserves some sympathy, she declared. However much he may have made her worry and suffer during the past days, surely she should forgive him when he arrives with his clothes all drenched. I wondered what gave her such an idea. If a man has been visiting one night after night, and then comes again despite a heavy downpour, it shows that he cannot bear to be separated for even a single evening, and one has good reason to be impressed. If, on the other hand, he has made one worry by letting several days go by, one is bound to question his sincerity, even if he should choose to appear on a stormy night. But no doubt people have different feelings about these matters. Narinabu is in fact devoted to a woman who has quick wits and a mind of her own, and who also impresses him as being kind-hearted. But he has several other attachments, not to mention his wife, and he cannot come very often. If he chooses such a terrible night to visit the woman, It can only be because he knows people will talk and praise him for his devotion. Of course, if he had no feeling for her at all, he would not bother to invent such stratagems. When it is raining, I feel absolutely miserable. I entirely forget how beautiful the weather was earlier in the day, and everything seems hateful, whether I am in one of the beautiful galleries in the palace or in a very ordinary house. Nothing gives me the slightest pleasure, and I can think of one thing only: when will the rain stop? When the moon is shining, I love to receive a visitor, even if it is someone who has not come to see me for 10 days, 20 days, a month, a year, or perhaps 7 or 8 years, and who has been inspired by the moonlight to remember our previous meetings. Even if I am in a place where it is hopelessly difficult to receive visitors, and where one is constantly in fear of being seen, I will allow the man to speak with me, though we may have to stand up all the time. And then, if it is at all possible, I will keep him with me for the night. Moonlight makes me think of people who are far away and also reminds me of things in the past, sad things, happy things, things that delighted me, as though they had just happened. I do not like the tale of Kumano in the slightest, for its language is old-fashioned, and it contains hardly anything of interest. Yet I am always moved by the moonlight scene in which one of the characters recalls past events, and producing a moth-eaten fan, recites the line, "My horse has come this way before." My dislike of rain is so profound that even a little shower strikes me as hateful. It only needs to rain, and the most splendid ceremonies, occasions that I should otherwise have found delightful and affecting, become a pointless nuisance. Why then should I be so impressed when a man comes to see me dripping with rain and full of complaints? Captain Achicubo, he who quarreled with Captain Catano, is certainly an attractive character, and what makes one like him so much is that he visited the heroine not only on the night when it was raining, but also on the 2 previous nights. I remember that he had to wash his feet on arrival. How disgusting they must have been. If he hadn't visited the lady on the previous nights, there would have been nothing so admirable about his coming on the rainy one. I am delighted when a man visits me on a very windy night. Then I really feel that he cares for me. I also like having a visitor when it is snowing. A secret visit is especially enjoyable. As one waits for the man, one whispers to oneself, "Can he forget?" It is very pleasant, too, when one is staying in a place where one can receive a visitor openly, and he arrives in clothes that are cold and damp from the snow. He may be wearing a hunting costume, an over-robe, the yellow-green robes of a chamberlain, or, best of all, a proper court cloak. But even if he is dressed in a short green robe, I am quite content so long as it has been moistened by the snow. In the old days, chamberlains always used to wear their yellow-green robes when visiting women at night, and if they had got wet in the rain, they would wring them out. But nowadays, they all seem to wear their short green robes, even for daytime visits. How handsome the chamberlains looked when they came dressed in yellow-green, especially those who were also serving as guards officers. After they have heard my views on the subject, I wonder whether there will be any gentlemen who refrain from visiting their ladies in the rain. One bright, moonlit night, a messenger thrust a note into the ante-room where I was staying. On a sheet of magnificent scarlet paper, I read the words, "There is nothing." It was the moonlight that made this so delightful. I wonder whether I would have enjoyed it at all on a rainy night. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 153. On one occasion, a man, who invariably sent me a letter after we had spent the night together, declared that he saw no point in our relationship and that he had nothing more to say to me. There was no word from him on the next day. When dawn appeared, without the usual next morning letter, I could not help feeling rather gloomy. Well, I thought as the day advanced, he really meant what he says. It rained very hard on the day after that. Noon came and still I had heard nothing from him. Obviously, he had forgotten all about me. Then in the evening, while I was sitting on the edge of the veranda, a child arrived with an open umbrella in one hand and a letter in the other. I opened the letter and read it with more than usual haste. The rain that swells the water was the message, and I found this more charming than if he had sent me a whole sheaf of poems. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 154. As the lady to whom the letter was addressed opened it, I was able to observe that it had been knotted into a very narrow strip, and that there were delicate indentations in the paper where it had been folded. The ink was extremely dark in some places, light in others, and the columns of writing, which covered both sides of the paper, came very close together. Even from where I was standing, it was a great pleasure to watch the lady as she read the letter carefully, then read it all over again. I wondered what it actually said, and seeing her smile became even more curious. I was too far away, however, to make it out. The most I could do was to guess at a few of the characters that were written in particularly dark ink. An attractive woman, whose hair tumbles loosely over her forehead, has received a letter in the dark. Evidently, she is too impatient to wait for a lamp. Instead, she takes some fire, tongs, and, lifting a piece of burning charcoal from the brazier, laboriously reads by its pale light. It is a charming scene. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 155. The Thunder Guards are awe-inspiring when they appear during a violent thunderstorm. The major and middle captains and the other officers of the two guards' divisions make a delightful sight as they post themselves next to the lattices in the palace. When the thunder has abated, one of the major captains orders the soldiers to go up or go down. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 156. One has taken a roundabout way to avoid an unlucky direction. It is late at night when one approaches home, and the carriage attendants walk with their heads bent to protect themselves against the terrible cold. Finally, one arrives and pulls up a brazier. It is delightful enough when live embers cover the entire surface, but it is a particular pleasure to find a glowing ember under a covering of ash. Then one starts talking to one's companions and does not even notice that the fire had gone out. Often a maid will lay some fresh charcoal on top and light it. This annoys me greatly, though it is all right if she lights the fire in the center. It is also very annoying when a maid rakes all the embers to the sides of the brazier, then piles up some new charcoal in the middle and places the burning embers on top. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 157. One day, when the snow lay thick on the ground, and it was so cold that the lattices had all been closed, I and the other ladies were sitting with Her Majesty, chatting and poking the embers in the brazier. "Tell me, Shonagon," said the Empress, "how is the snow on Hsiang Lu Peak?" I told the maid to raise one of the lattices and then rolled up the blind all the way. Her Majesty smiled. I was not alone in recognizing the Chinese poem she had quoted. In fact, all the ladies knew the lines and had even rewritten them in Japanese. Yet no one but me had managed to think of it instantly. "Yes, indeed," people said when they heard the story. "She was born to serve an empress like ours." Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 158. The boys employed by masters of divination know their job very well. When their employer has gone to perform a service of purification, the boys recite the invocations in his place, and everyone accepts this as normal. Again, if a patient has lost consciousness, The boys quickly and expertly sprinkle cold water on his face without a word from their master. It makes me envious to see how clever they are, and I only wish I could have such boys in my service. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 159. Once in the 3rd month, I spent a period of abstinence in a friend's house. It was a modest place, and the trees in the garden were not worth noticing. One of them was called a willow, but it was broad-leaved and had none of the willow's usual charm. "It doesn't look like a willow at all," I remarked. "All the same," insisted the people of the house, "it is a kind of willow." The following poem then occurred to me. Ah, what a house this is, where the eyebrows of the willow's leaves grow so impudently broad that they make the spring itself lose face. During this same period of abstinence, I went to stay in another rather simple house. On the 2nd day, when I was becoming very bored and wishing that I could return at once to the palace, I was delighted to receive a letter from the Empress. Her Majesty's poem had been beautifully copied by Lady Sei Shōnagon on a sheet of light green paper. So hard to bear these past 2 days, how could I have lived those years gone by? To this, Lady Sei Shōnagon had added her own message. Already I feel as if it were 1,000 years. Please hurry back tomorrow morning. Don't even wait for the sun to rise. Lady Sei Shōnagon's words were charming enough, but the Empress's letter overwhelmed me, and instead of sending a perfunctory reply, I composed this poem. How sadly have I viewed these long spring days from my poor dwelling place, when even one who lives above the clouds has found them hard to bear. And to Lady Sei Shōnagon I wrote, perhaps I shall not even survive this night, but suffer the captain's sad fate. I returned to the palace at dawn on the following day. I did not like your poem about the long spring days, said the Empress when she saw me. My ladies also criticized it severely. This made me very unhappy, but no doubt Her Majesty had good reason to reproach me. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 160. Once when I had gone to Kiyomizu Temple for a retreat, and was listening with deep emotion to the loud cry of the cicadas, a special messenger brought me a note from Her Majesty written on a sheet of red, tinted Chinese paper. Count each echo of the temple bell as it tolls the vespers by the mountain's side. Then you will know how many times my heart is beating out its love for you. What a long stay you are making, she added. Surely you realize how much I miss you. Since I had forgotten to bring along any suitable paper, I wrote my reply on a purple lotus petal. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 161. On the 24th of the 12th month, the Empress arranged that there should be a naming of the Buddhas. It must have been well past midnight when the leader finished the first service, and we all left the temple, some to return home, others to set out for a secret tryst. I shared a carriage with some other people, and we had a delightful drive. The snow had been coming down for days, but in the morning it had stopped, and now there was a strong wind. Here and there one could see a patch of black earth where the snow had been blown away, but the rooftops were completely white, and even the wretched huts of the poor people were very pretty under their covering of snow, evenly lit by a pale moon as though they were thatched with silver. The icicles, which seemed to have been deliberately hung in different lengths from all the eaves, were incredibly beautiful and looked like waterfalls of crystal. The outer blinds of our carriage had been pulled up, and since there were no inner curtains, the moonlight came right inside. I could see a lady who was covered in about 8 layers of light violet, red plum, white, and other robes. Over this, she wore a cloak of dark violet, which shone with a brilliant luster. Next to her sat a gentleman in laced trousers of grape-colored material with a heavily figured design. He wore several white robes, and at the opening of his sleeves, one could see the yellow rose and scarlet of his underrobes. He had undone the dazzlingly white sash of his court cloak, which he wore off one shoulder so that one had a clear view of the robes beneath. He sat in such a way that one of his legs reached into the front of the carriage, and any passer-by would have found his posture delightful. The lady had slipped into the back of the carriage to avoid the brilliance of the moonlight, but much to her embarrassment, the gentleman now pulled her forward. Again and again he recited the words, "Piercing cold, it spreads like ice." It was a delightful scene, and I should have liked to spend the entire night traveling in the carriage, but alas, we soon reached our destination. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 162. When a group of ladies, in waiting, are on leave from court and have gathered in a room, it is delightful for the master of the household to hear them exchanging flattering remarks about their mistresses and gossiping about the latest news from the palace. I should like to live in a large, attractive house. My family would of course be staying with me, and in one of the wings I should have a friend, an elegant lady, in waiting from the palace with whom I could converse. Whenever we wished, we should meet to discuss recent poems and other things of interest. When my friend received a letter, we should read it together and write our answer. If someone came to pay my friend a visit, I should receive him in one of our beautifully decorated rooms. And if he was prevented from leaving by a rain, storm, or something of the sort, I should warmly invite him to stay. Whenever my friend went to the palace, I should help her with her preparations and see that she had what was needed during her stay at court. For everything about well-born people delights me. But I suppose this dream of mine is rather absurd. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 163. When one meets people who have a bad reputation, such people often give a more sincere impression than those of good repute. When one travels by boat, I remember one such excursion. It was a beautiful, clear day, and the sea was so calm that its surface looked like a sheet of light green, glossy silk. I was traveling with a group of young women, and none of us had the slightest sense of danger. Dressed in our short jackets, we helped the boatmen at the oars, singing song after song as we rowed. It was a most delightful trip, and I only wished that someone of high rank were there to see us gliding across the water. Then all of a sudden a violent wind blew up, and the sea became terribly rough. We were beside ourselves with fear. As we rowed back to the shore, the waves leapt over the boat, and I could not believe that this was the same sea that a little while ago had been so smooth. When one thinks of it, sailors are the bravest people in the world. Even in reasonably shallow water, their vessels are far too flimsy to be safe. Yet they do not hesitate to embark on a sea of any depth, perhaps even 1,000 fathoms, entrusting their lives to a boat so heavily loaded that the water comes up almost to the edge. The common people who man the boat run up and down, never giving a thought to the danger. And though it looks as if the slightest rocking would capsize it, one sees them banging down into the hold half a dozen great pine logs 2 or 3 feet in circumference. Amazing. People of quality travel in boats with cabins. These, of course, seem far safer, especially if one is in the rear. But if one is near the side, one gets very dizzy. The ropes that keep the oars in place, the fast cords as they are called, look extraordinarily weak. What if one of them were to snap? Surely the rower would be plunged into the sea. Yet I have never seen anyone using heavy ropes. I remember one journey on such a boat. We had a charming cabin, fitted with head blinds, double doors, and lattices. Though the boat did not seem quite as sturdy as most of its kind, I felt as if I were in a snug little house. But when I looked out and saw the other boats, I was really frightened. Those in the distance looked as frail as bamboo leaves that have been made into toy boats and scattered across the water. When we finally returned to the harbor, lights were shining in all the boats, which was a delightful sight. On the following morning, I was very moved to observe people rowing out to sea in those tiny vessels known as sampans. As they moved slowly into the distance, the white waves behind the boats did in fact disappear without a trace. When all is said and done, only common people should go in boats. There are dangers enough when one travels by land, but then at least one has the firm ground under one's feet, and that is a great comfort. The sea is a frightening thing at the best of times. How much more terrifying must it be for those poor women divers who have to plunge into its depths for their livelihood? One wonders what would happen to them if the cord round their waist were to break. I can imagine men doing this sort of work, but for a woman, it must take remarkable courage. After the woman has been lowered into the water, the men sit comfortably in their boats, heartily singing songs as they keep an eye on the mulberry bark cord that floats on the surface. It is an amazing sight, for they do not show the slightest concern about the risks the woman is taking. When finally she wants to come up, she gives a tug on her cord, and the men haul her out of the water with a speed that I can well understand. Soon she is clinging to the side of the boat, her breath coming in painful gasps. The sight is enough to make even an outsider feel the brine dripping. I can hardly imagine this is a job that anyone would covet. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 164. A certain lieutenant in the right division of the outer palace guards looked down on his parents and was ashamed that people should see them. When they were journeying up to the capital from Iyo province, he pushed them both into the sea and they drowned. People were dismayed by his action and regarded it as shameful. Yet on the 15th day of the 7th month, the man said that he was going to celebrate the festival of the dead in honor of his parents, and he began to busy himself with preparations. When the holy teacher, Domai, was told about this, he wrote the following poem, which I find really delightful. A man who drowned his parents in the ocean's depths now celebrates the feast of Bon, a sorry sight indeed. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 165. Once I wrote down in my notebook a poem that had greatly appealed to me. Unfortunately, one of the maids saw it and recited the lines clumsily. It really is awful when someone rattles off a poem without any proper feeling. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 166. If a servant girl says about someone, "What a delightful gentleman he is," one immediately looks down on him, whereas if she insulted the person in question, it would have the opposite effect. Praise from a servant can also damage a woman's reputation. Besides, people of that class always manage to express themselves badly when they are trying to say something nice. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 167. One evening, Korchika, the major counselor, came to the palace and lectured to the emperor on literature, his visit lasting as usual until late at night. Gradually, the ladies in attendance on their majesties retired by ones and twos to lie down behind their screens or curtains of state, until I was the only one left. I was struggling to keep myself awake when I heard the officer of the guards announce, "The ox, 4th quarter." "It's already dawn," I murmured. "Well then, your majesty," said Korchika, "it is no longer worthwhile to go to bed." I was shocked by his remark. After all, even if Korchika felt no need for sleep himself, why should he prevent his majesty from resting? If there had been other ladies in the room, I should have said something since my voice would not have been recognized among theirs. But as it was, I found it wiser to stay silent. Meanwhile, the emperor dozed off, leaning against a pillar. "Look at him," said Korchika to the empress. "How can he possibly sleep now that dawn is here? "Yes, indeed," said Her Majesty, and burst out laughing. But the emperor was deaf to it all. There was a young girl in the palace who was employed as a maid by one of the housekeepers. She had caught a cock and was keeping it in her room, intending to take it home on the following day. Somehow or other, the bird was found by a dog and fled all the way to the end of the gallery, letting out the most piercing squawks. Everyone woke up, including the emperor, who came to himself with a start and asked what had happened. Korchika replied by loudly declaiming the words from the Chinese poem, "The prudent monarch rises from his sleep." My own eyes were heavy with sleep, but the magnificent way in which Korchika recited the line made me open them wide. Their Majesties were both delighted and complimented the counselor on his apt quotation. Such things are really very splendid. At about midnight on the following evening, when the emperor had retired to his bedchamber and I had just called for my servant, Korchika came up to me. "Are you going to your room?" he said. "Let me escort you." Having hung my ceremonial over skirt and my Chinese jacket on a screen, I allowed him to accompany me. His court cloak looked dazzlingly white in the bright moonlight. I noticed that his loose trousers were a bit too long and that he stepped on them as he walked. At one point, he held my sleeve and said, "Be careful not to trip." Then, as he continued guiding me along the corridors, he recited the line, "As the traveler journeys by the dying moon's faint light." I was overjoyed at the quotation, so much so indeed that Korchika laughingly remarked, "You do let yourself get excited by such things, don't you?" Yes, I thought, but how can one help being impressed when someone recites poetry so beautifully? Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 168. One day I was in the apartment of Her Highness, the Mistress of the Robes, together with Mama, the nurse of the Lord Bishop, when I noticed a man coming along the wooden balcony outside the room. He seemed to be on the verge of tears. "A terrible thing has happened to me," he said. "I don't know where to appeal." "Well," we asked, "what is it?" "I was obliged to leave home for a while," he replied, "and while I was absent, my miser Abel house was burnt down. For the past several days, I have had to live like a hermit, crab, squeezing myself into other people's houses. The fire started in one of the hay lofts belonging to the imperial stables and quickly spread to my home. There is only a fence between the two buildings, and one of the lads in the bedroom just escaped being burnt alive. They didn't save a single object. We all burst out laughing at this, including the Mistress of the Robes. I took a sheet of paper and wrote, "If the vernal sun burns strong enough to sprout the young grass roots, even a place like Yodo Plain can ill survive its heat." "Kindly give him this," I told Mama, throwing the paper to her. With loud laughter, Mama handed the poem to the man. "Madam has presented you with this," she explained, "because she is so sorry for you at having lost your house." "What does the record slip say?" he asked. "How much is she giving me?" "Read it first," said one of the ladies. "But how can I, madam?" he asked. "Neither of my eyes is up to that." "Well then, ask someone to read it for you," said the lady. "We can't help you. The Empress has sent for us, and we must go to the palace directly. But with such a splendid document in your hands, you have nothing more to worry about." Roaring with laughter, we set off for the palace. "I wonder if he's shown it to anyone yet," said one of my companions after a while. "How furious he will be when he hears what it really is." When we saw Her Majesty, Mama told her what had happened, and there was a lot more laughter. The Empress herself joined in, saying, "How can you all be so mad?" Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 169. A young man has lost his mother. The father loves him dearly but marries again, and the stepmother turns out to be a very disagreeable woman. the son is no longer allowed into the main part of the house and lives in one of the wings or in a guest room. This is a pleasant enough room, with some outstanding paintings on the screens and panels. An old nurse, or possibly a maid who used to work for his mother, looks after his wardrobe. He is very popular at court. Even the emperor enjoys his company and frequently summons him to join in concerts. The young man has an extraordinarily amorous nature. For all this, he is constantly unhappy, and nothing in the world seems to please him. The only person to whom he feels close is his elder sister. She is married to a high court noble who dotes upon her and regards her as unique. The young man confides all his feelings to this sister, and she is his great consolation in life. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 170. The smartest robes, after all, are those with evenly matched sleeves that people have worn since ancient times. I don't mind if both the sleeves are very wide, but such robes are rather awkward for court ladies in ceremonial dress. The fashion of unequal sleeves is just as unattractive for men as for women, since it produces the same lop-sided effect. Yet nowadays everyone seems to have his clothes cut like this, whether he is wearing a fine ceremonial robe or a light summer garment. Fashionable, good-looking people really dress in a most inconvenient way. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 171. Chest trouble. Illnesses caused by evil spirits. Beriberi. Illnesses that cannot be properly identified, yet that make people lose all their appetite. Once I saw a girl of about 18 with magnificent hair that hung in thick tresses all the way to her feet. She was nicely plump and had splendid white skin. Apart from her charming features, she was obviously of good breeding. At the moment, she was suffering from a very bad toothache. Her hair was in great disorder, and where it hung over her forehead, it was damp with tears. Quite unconscious of this, she kept pressing her hand against her flushed cheek, which made a delightful effect. On another occasion, I saw a girl in an unlined robe of soft white material, an attractive trouser skirt, and a bright aster cloak. She had a terrible pain in her chest. Her fellow ladies, in waiting, visited her one after another, while outside her room a crowd of young noblemen had come to inquire about her. "How dreadfully sad," they exclaimed. "Has she ever suffered from this before?" In fact, none of them seemed particularly concerned, except one who, being the girl's lover, was obviously very distressed about her illness. Since their relations were secret, he was frightened of attracting attention, and though he entered her room, he did not dare come too close. I found it fascinating to watch him standing there, his eyes full of anxiety. She bound back her beautiful long hair and sat up in bed, saying that she was going to be sick. It was painful to see how ill she looked, yet there was something charming about her appearance. The Empress, having heard about the girl's condition, sent a priest who was known for his skill in performing the sacred readings. He installed himself behind a curtain of state and started to intone his sutras. Since it was a very small room, it was impossible to provide screens and curtains for all the ladies who had come to visit their friend and who now wanted to hear the recitation. They were therefore clearly exposed to view, and while the priest read the scriptures, he kept glancing in their direction, which no doubt earned him a heavy load of guilt. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 172. I cannot bear men to eat when they come to visit ladies, in waiting in the palace. I also object to women who offer food to their male guests. Sometimes these women become quite insistent and say they will do nothing until the man has eaten. In such cases, he is bound to give in. After all, He cannot very well put his hand in front of his mouth or turn his head the other way with a look of disgust. For my part, even if a man arrived very late and very drunk, I should never offer him so much as a bowl of watered rice. If he thinks I am heartless and decides not to repeat his visit, well then, let him stay away. Of course, if I am at home and one of the maids brings my visitor something from the kitchen, there is nothing I can do about it. Yet I find this just as disagreeable. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 173. It is very annoying when one has visited Haste Temple and has retired into one's enclosure to be disturbed by a herd of calm moan people who come and sit outside in a row, crowded so close together that the tails of their robes fall over each other in utter disarray. I remember that once I was overcome by a great desire to go on a pilgrimage. Having made my way up the log steps, deafened by the fearful roar of the river, I hurried into my enclosure, longing to gaze upon the sacred countenance of Buddha. To my dismay, I found that a throng of commoners had settled themselves directly in front of me, where they were incessantly standing up, prostrating themselves, and squatting down again. They looked like so many worms as they crowded together in their hideous clothes, leaving hardly an inch of space between themselves and me. I really felt like pushing them all over sideways. Important visitors always have a tendency to clear such pests from their enclosures, but it is not so easy for ordinary people like me. If one summons one of the priests who is responsible for looking after the pilgrims, he simply says something like, "You there, move back a little, won't you?" And as soon as he has left, things are as bad as before. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 174. The way in which carpenters eat is really odd. When they had finished the main building and were working on the eastern wing, some carpenters squatted in a row to have their meal. I sat on the veranda and watched them. The moment the food was brought, they fell on the soup bowls and gulped down the contents. Then they pushed the bowls aside and finished off all the vegetables. I wondered whether they were going to leave their rice. A moment later, there wasn't a grain left in the bowls. They all behaved in exactly the same way, so I suppose this must be the custom of carpenters. I should not call it a very charming one. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 175. One night in the 9th month, a certain lady was visited by a young man who, though not of the highest nobility, was known for his elegance and keen wits. He left before dawn when the moon still hung in the sky, bathing the whole landscape with its beautiful light. Determined that the lady should think back fondly on their parting, he whispered to her every endearment that he knew. She stood watching for a long time as he disappeared into the distance, believing that this was the last she would see of him that night. The scene was beautiful beyond words. Her lover, however, had only pretended to be leaving. Presently he came back and hid behind a garden fence, intending to let the lady know he was still there. Just then she glanced in his direction and recited the words, "Like the moon that lingers in the dawning sky." According to what the man told people later, the moonlight seemed to be shining like a great lamp only a few inches from where the lady was standing, and he was so overcome by the sight that he left without a word. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 176. With Lord Naruto, however, things are totally different. Whether in the middle of the night or at dawn, no lady who borrows his carriage suffers even the slightest embarrassment. He must certainly have trained his attendants carefully. If Naruto is traveling at night and sees some lady's carriage that is stuck in a deep rut and surrounded by a group of furious drivers, he sends his own carriage over to goad the oxen and help the carriage on its way. A man who shows such concern for mere strangers must have given his attendants the most careful instructions about looking after the passengers in his own carriage. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 177. A young bachelor of an adventurous nature comes home at dawn, having spent the night in some amorous encounter. Though he still looks sleepy, he immediately draws his ink stone to him, and after carefully rubbing it with ink, starts to write his next morning letter. He does not let his brush run down the paper in a careless scrawl, but puts himself heart and soul into the calligraphy. What a charming figure he makes as he sits there by himself in an easy posture, with his robe falling slightly open. It is a plain, unlined robe of pure white, and over it he wears a cloak of rose, yellow or crimson. As he finishes his letter, he notices that the white robe is still damp from the dew, and for a while he gazes at it fondly. Then he makes arrangements for delivering his letter. Instead of calling one of the ladies in attendance, he takes the trouble to get up and select a page boy who seems suitable for the task. Summoning the boy to his side, he whispers his instructions and hands over the letter. The page leaves for the lady's house, and for some time the gentleman watches him disappear in the distance. As he sits there, he quietly murmurs some appropriate passage from the sutras. Now one of his servants comes to announce that his washing water and morning gruel have been prepared in the neighboring wing. The gentleman goes there, and soon he is leaning against the reading desk and looking at some Chinese poems, from which he now and then reads out a passage that he has particularly enjoyed, altogether a charming sight. Presently he performs his ablutions and changes into a white court cloak, which he wears without any trousers. Thus attired, he starts reciting the 6th scroll of the Lotus Sutra from memory. A pious gentleman indeed, or so one might think, except that at just this moment the messenger returns. He cannot have had far to go and nods encouragingly to his master, who thereupon instantly interrupts his recitation, and with what might strike one as sinful haste, transfers his attention to the lady's reply. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 178. It is noon on a summer day, and the weather is so hot that one does not know what to do with oneself. One keeps waving one's fan, but there is not a breath of cool air. Then, just as one is hurrying to put one's hands in a bowl of iced water, a letter arrives. It is written on a sheet of fine, brilliantly red paper, and attached to a Chinese pink in full bloom. Without thinking, one lays aside one's fan, which was not doing much good in any case, and imagines how deeply one's friend must feel to have taken all this trouble on such a suffocating day. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 179. By the light of the lamp one can see that the blinds further back in the room have been raised all the way. Below them, several women, including a couple of ladies, in waiting, girl attendants, and others, sit leaning against the raised beam between the ante room and the veranda. In another part of the room, some more ladies are huddled together under a closed blind. A fire is smoldering deep in the incense burner, giving out a scent that is vaguely melancholy and full of a calm elegance. Late in the evening, there is a stealthy tap outside. A lady in waiting, the one who always knows what is happening, hurries to the gate and lets in the gentleman visitor. Then, with a smug look on her face, she stealthily leads him to the lady who has been awaiting his arrival. From one side of the hall comes the beautiful sound of lute music. The player plucks the strings so gently that even when the murmur of conversation dies down, one can barely make out the notes. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 180. At first dawn, a carriage passes along the nearby avenue. The gentleman who is traveling in it has raised the blinds so that he can enjoy the beautiful pale moon, and one is delighted to hear him recite in a most elegant voice, as the traveler goes by the dying moon's faint light. It is delightful also when a man on horseback recites poetry at dawn. I remember that once I heard a splendid line of verse, accompanied by the flapping of a horse's mud shields. Who could the writer be? When I put aside what I was doing and looked out, I was dismayed to see that he was a vulgar commoner. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 181. A handsome young gentleman is riding along on horseback, beautifully dressed in a court cloak, over, robe, and hunting costume, with the full array of his varicolored under robes emerging at the opening of his sleeves. Still in his saddle, he hands an elegantly knotted letter to the servant who accompanies him on foot. It is delightful to observe how the man looks up at his master as he takes the letter from him. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 182. The house had a spacious courtyard and was shadowed by tall pine trees. To the south and east, the lattice windows were all wide open. It gave a cool feeling when one looked inside. In the main room was a 4-foot curtain of state, and in front of it a round hassock on which a priest was kneeling. He was in his early 30s and quite handsome. Over his gray habit, he wore a fine silk stole. Altogether, the effect was magnificent. Cooling himself with a clove-scented fan, he recited the magic incantation of the 1,000 hands. I gathered that someone in the house was seriously ill, for now a heavily built girl with a splendid head of hair edged her way into the room. Clearly this was the medium to whom the evil spirit was going to be transferred. She was wearing an unlined robe of stiff silk and long, light-colored trousers. When the girl had sat down next to the priest in front of a small 3-foot curtain of state, he turned round and handed her a thin, highly polished wand. Then, with his eyes tightly shut, he began to read the mystic incantations, his voice coming out in staccato bursts as he uttered the sacred syllables. It was an impressive sight, and many of the ladies of the house came out from behind the screens and curtains and sat watching in a group. After a short time, the medium began to tremble and fell into a trance. It was awesome indeed to see how the priest's incantations were steadily taking effect. The medium's brother, a slender young man in a long robe who had only recently celebrated his coming of age, stood behind the girl, fanning her. Everyone who witnessed the scene was overcome with respect. It occurred to me how embarrassed the girl herself would feel to be exposed like this if she were in her normal state of mind. She lay there groaning and wailing in the most terrible way, and though one realized that she was in no actual pain, one could not help sympathizing with her. Indeed, one of the patient's friends, feeling sorry for the girl, went up to her curtain of state and helped to rearrange her disordered clothing. Meanwhile, it was announced that the patient was a little better. Some young attendants were sent to the kitchen to fetch hot water and other requisites. Even while they were carrying their trays, they kept darting uneasy glances at the exorcist. They wore pretty unlined robes and formal skirts whose light mauve color was as fresh as on the day they were dyed. It made a most charming effect. By the hour of the monkey, the priest had brought the spirit under control, and having forced it to beg for mercy, he now dismissed it. "Oh," exclaimed the medium. "I thought I was behind the curtains, and here I am in front. What on earth has happened?" Overcome with embarrassment, she hid her face in her long hair and was about to glide out of the room when the priest stopped her, and after murmuring a few incantations, said, "Well, my dear, how do you feel? You should be quite yourself by now." He smiled at the girl, but this only added to her confusion. "I should have liked to stay a little longer," said the priest, as he prepared to leave the house, "but I am afraid it is almost time for my evening prayers." The people of the house tried to stop him. "Please wait a moment," they said. "We should like to make an offering." But the priest was obviously in a great hurry and would not stay. At this point, a lady of noble rank, evidently a member of the family, edged her way up to the priest's curtain of state and said, "We are most grateful for your visit, Your Reverence." Our patient looked as if she might well succumb to the evil spirit, but now she is well on the way to recovery. I cannot tell you how delighted we are. If Your Reverence has any free time tomorrow, would you please call again? "I fear we are dealing with a very obstinate spirit," the priest replied briefly, "and we must not be off our guard. I am pleased that what I did today has helped the patient." So saying, he took his leave with an air of such dignity that everyone felt the Buddha himself had appeared on earth. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 183. Someone in a robe whose back seam is crooked. People who wear their clothes with the collars pulled back. A high court noble's carriage that has dirty blinds. People who insist on bringing out all their children when they receive a visit from someone who rarely comes to see them. Boys who wear high clogs with their skirts. I realize that this is the modern fashion, but I still don't like it. Women in traveling costumes who walk in a great hurry. A priest who is acting as a master of divination and who wears a paper head dressed to perform a service of purification. A thin, ugly woman who has dark skin and wears a wig. A lean, hirsute man taking a nap in the daytime. Does it occur to him what a spectacle he is making of himself? Ugly men should sleep only at night, for they cannot be seen in the dark, and besides, most people are in bed themselves. But they should get up at the crack of dawn, so that no one has to see them lying down. A pretty woman looks even prettier when she gets up after taking a nap on a summer day. But an unattractive woman should avoid such things, for her face will be all puffy and shining, and if she is not lucky, her cheeks will have an ugly, lopsided look. When two people, having taken a nap together in the daytime, wake up and see each other's sleep, swollen faces, how dreary life must seem to them. A dark-skinned person looks very ugly in an unlined robe of stiff silk. If the robe is scarlet, however, it looks better, even though it is just as transparent. I suppose one of the reasons I do not like ugly women to wear unlined robes is that one can see their navels. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 184. When the middle captain of the Left Guards Division was still governor of Ise, he visited me one day at my home. There was a straw mat at the edge of the veranda, and I pulled it out for him. This notebook of mine happened to be lying on the mat, but I did not notice it in time. I snatched at the book and made a desperate effort to get it back, but the captain instantly took it off with him and did not return it until much later. I suppose it was from this time that my book began to be passed about at court. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 185. It is getting so dark that I can scarcely go on writing, and my brush is all worn out. Yet I should like to add a few things before I end. I wrote these notes at home, when I had a good deal of time to myself, and thought no one would notice what I was doing. Everything that I have seen and felt is included. Since much of it might appear malicious and even harmful to other people, I was careful to keep my book hidden. But now it has become public, which is the last thing I expected. One day Lord Corsica, the minister of the center, brought the Empress a bundle of notebooks. "What shall we do with them?" Her Majesty asked me. The emperor has already made arrangements for copying the records of the historian. Let me make them into a pillow, I said. Very well, said Her Majesty. You may have them. I now had a vast quantity of paper at my disposal, and I set about filling the notebooks with odd facts, stories from the past, and all sorts of other things, often including the most trivial material. On the whole, I concentrated on things and people that I found charming and splendid. My notes are also full of poems and observations on trees and plants, birds and insects. I was sure that when people saw my book, they would say, "It's even worse than I expected." Now one can really tell what she is like. After all, it is written entirely for my own amusement, and I put things down exactly as they came to me. How could my casual jottings possibly bear comparison with the many impressive books that exist in our time? Readers have declared, however, that I can be proud of my work. This has surprised me greatly. Yet I suppose it is not so strange that people should like it, for, as will be gathered from these notes of mine, I am the sort of person who approves of what others abhor and detests the things they like. Whatever people may think of my book, I still regret that it ever came to light.